Welcome back. Today is 2.2, the nature of music. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Here's a little bit of what we'll be getting into. I hope you enjoyed exploring the electronic music interactive resource, and I'd like to thank the University of Oregon and Jeffrey Stollett for letting us explore your great resource here. I will be covering some of this material or all of this material again today, but with a little different point of view than Stollett. As you like, you can look back through these materials, especially if you're just a little confused about a definition, for example, waveform or synthesis. You can reference this, and we won't be following the same trajectory as this article, but we will be exploring these topics that you read about. We're going to begin our discussions in this lesson by thinking about how sound works. So sound is a disturbance in a medium that is perceived. So the medium is often air. Right now we can think about if I snap my fingers, there is a sound source, which would be the snapping, the medium, which is the air, and a receiver, which is my ear. So I hear myself snapping, and that's because the sound source is created a disturbance in the medium that is pushing the airwaves at my ear in positive and negative pressure, and I perceive that as sound. We have talked a little bit about a waveform. A waveform is a very important way of visualizing and studying sound. It's the graph that has a line through the center that is zero. If you think about flatlining, a sound would just be completely silent if it's only on that center line. But the way sound works is to oscillate positive and negative back and forth. So if we think about visually like a polygraph test, or even the pendulum of a clock, think about something that moves back and forth. In fact, we could draw our own waveform on a piece of paper if we were to move a pencil in one direction, like a pendulum. So let's say we're moving the pencil back and forth this way. If we drew a line down the center of the page, and then we moved our pencil like this, we could pull the page along as we move, and we would be graphing sound like a waveform. So that's the way that it works, like a pendulum, in that it moving to one side or the other is less important than the fact that it's not at rest and it has moved away from the zero line. So when we think about graphing sound, we think about 1 and -1, but they are equivalent in terms of pressure difference from our ear. So let's look now briefly at a waveform and remind ourselves of what that shows. You can see here the zero line and the line or the area for -1 and +1 up above. Notice that this wave moves from 0 up to about 1, back down to 0, down to -1, and back to 0. And in a moment we'll talk about that as a cycle. So just keep in mind that as sound moves toward and away from our ears, it's creating these differences of pressure, which are what equate volume. So this -1 and this +1 are the same volume to our ear. You can just think about it as a distance from 0. I like to think about the hummingbird and its wings. So the hummingbird gets its name for obvious reasons. It makes a humming sound when it comes nearby. That's because its wings are flapping so fast. They flap fast enough to be in our audio range as a pitch. Of course, larger birds will flap their wings, just not nearly as fast, so they wouldn't be heard as pitch, but more like a rhythm. The hummingbird can flap their wings from about 50 to 200 times per second. In our language, that converts to 50 to 200 hertz. So well playable by a guitar or a bass or a piano or sung. This example that we're going to listen to in a moment is a recording of a hummingbird coming up to a feeder, and we will hear how, as it flaps its wings, we hear the cycles per second. We hear it as a pitch, and that pitch is around 100 hertz, which is like a G sharp, a few frets up on the guitar or in the mid-low range of the piano. Let's hear that. So first we're going to listen to this recording of a hummingbird. You will also hear some other bugs and nature sounds outdoors, but we're focused on the low pitch that is the flapping speed of the hummingbird's wings. So the hummingbird is flapping its wings at a very consistent rate of about 100 times per second. So in our language of frequency, that means 100 cycles per second or 100 hertz. As we look at this sound and zoom in, we can see that it has a repeating shape that keeps coming back. And that repeating shape is called a period. It makes this a periodic sound and thus has a pitch. And each period is called a cycle. So if we trace one of these and look at our time up here, we can see how fast the frequency of these flaps are occurring. So if I zoom in to the point where up top here we see 2.08, 2.09, 2.10. I'll zoom in a little further. If you can't see these up here, again, that's 2.08, 2.09, and 2.10. So those are 100ths of a second. So if I look at the distance of 100th of a second here, let's see what happens. In this case, from 2.08 to 2.09, the sound starts above the zero line. So it starts up here with positive pressure. It comes down to the zero line. It crosses below down to negative pressure, back up to zero, and then back up to positive pressure to about the same place that we started over here. So that's a full cycle. Usually cycles are measured starting here on the zero line, which is also a tenth of a second, but I wanted to show the span of about a hundredth of a second, not a tenth of a second. So this is about 100th of a second, meaning that this happens 100 times per second. So that's another way of saying 100 hertz. So the natural flapping of these wings creates a periodic repeating cycle of sound that happens 100 times per second and creates our perception of its pitch. Let's hear it again. So I think that the hummingbird is a good way to visualize frequency and to visualize sound, because the way sound works is it's pushing pressure, it's disturbing the medium of air or water in predictable waves usually. So as the hummingbird comes close to our ear, it acts very similar to the way a speaker acts, to the way a string acts, and that's to move back and forth, creating these different pressures. So as the wing of the hummingbird comes close to your ear, it's creating a positive pressure, which is like this, and then it comes back to in between, and then it moves away from your ear, and that creates a negative pressure, like this, so, or this. So negative pressure, positive pressure, and repeating over and over is how sound works. So when we tell a speaker to play back this recording, we're telling it to move out away from your ear, come back and move toward your ear, and come back and try to recreate exactly what we heard from the hummingbird. So frequency is a measure of cycles per second. The more cycles we have per second, The higher the frequency, the faster the frequency. So we use these words high and low to describe frequency, but nothing is actually high or low about them. There are faster and slower frequencies. So a slower frequency like 20 hertz gives us a perception of a low pitch, and a fast frequency like 10,000 hertz gives us the impression of a high pitch. The reason that we call them high and low is because in musical notation, we notate a very low note at the bottom of the staff, and that is akin to a slow frequency. When we notate a high pitch way above the staff, that equates a fast frequency. Also, in the spectrogram, when we look at the graph of time and frequency, if we see something way at the top, we say that that is a high frequency. Really what it is a fast frequency. But it's totally fine to use these terms high and low. I just wanted to speak to that for a moment. So next we'll be talking a little bit about the range of human hearing. So the range of human hearing is about 20 hertz, 20 cycles per second, up to about 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. So 1,000 times higher. And those are our perceptions of pitch. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the range that we can hear, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens below and above that range. So again, the range of human hearing is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, or thereabouts. We refer to frequencies that fall above our range of hearing as ultrasound. You've probably heard that word before as a medical tool used for looking at prenatal babies. What's happening there is very, very high frequencies that are harmless, but we can't hear them. What's happening is the computer is looking at a visual picture by using very, very high frequencies and how fast they come back to the machine. So it's also a word, just thinking of music and acoustics and sound, ultrasound, that means above our range of hearing. So it still exists, but we don't hear it. An example would be a dog whistle. If you've heard of a dog whistle, it's designed to make a very, very high whistling pitch that's too high for humans to hear, so you can theoretically blow it all day and won't even be noticed by any humans, but the dog can hear it, and so they can hear higher than humans a little bit, and so they would be able to hear that whistle and come. Other animals can hear more or less frequencies than humans, usually more, and in some cases way, way more. I found this little graphic that shows some ranges of hearing. Here's the audible range of human hearing here in this color. It goes from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Below the range of human hearing is called infrasound. So we have ultrasound, which is very, very high and above our range of hearing, and below our hearing range called infrasound. You'll also hear that as subsonic. Sometimes it's called subsonic. So you can see that on this graph here. Here's the range of human hearing, and here is infrasound between 0 and 20 hertz, and up here, this whole range is ultrasound. But it's kind of fun to think about how the little box on a boat that finds fish sends out very, very high frequencies, very similar to an ultrasound machine, and gets a signal back, and those are pitches that we can't hear, but they help locate the fish. A bat, you've probably heard of echolocation, which is one of the ways that bats navigate flying very fast through a dark forest at night. They can hear extremely high frequencies. You can see this is going up to about 500,000 hertz. So that is way beyond 20,000. And so they can hear these very, very high frequencies and thus locate from them. Here's dolphins, which overlap with humans and also can hear very, very high. And then it shows medical instruments, like I mentioned, ultrasound machines around 1 megahertz, very, very, very high pitches. So, along with what we can hear, it's important to think about what the machines that we use to listen and examine pitch can do. So, microphones, for example, can pick up a similar range to human hearing, but they can pick up a little bit higher frequencies than we can hear, and they also don't always pick up as low as we can hear. So a microphone might not be able to hear and record 20 hertz, but it could probably record about 40 hertz. And speakers are similar, where speakers, like a medium-sized speaker, can go down to about maybe 40 or 60 hertz, unless you have a very large subwoofer, and that would be able to go down to about 20 or 30 hertz. So to explore a little bit about the range of our hearing, I've pulled up a program called Max MSP. Max MSP is an open-ended piece of software that lets you take objects like these numbers and toggle switches and sine waves and things like that and connect them together. You can see these lines, you can connect them together and make whatever you want. Today we're just going to be listening to a simple sine wave and sawtooth wave. The goal of this is not really to test exactly your personal range of hearing, but more for us to get a sense for what different frequency ranges sound like and whether we can perceive those differences. So please be advised that very high frequencies can be grating to the ears. What I'd suggest that you do is keep your hand on your volume control and turn down as needed, or mute if it feels uncomfortable. I already have turned down the volume for this video, so it's coming in at 1/10 the volume and 1/20 the volume, and then I have a volume knob over here. So I'm trying to keep it low enough that it doesn't hurt, but you can still hear it. So just as we start this off, start with your volume low and turn up or down as needed. Down here you can see we have a DAC, which is our digital to audio converter that functions as our output. So I'll start by turning on the audio by activating the DAC. And then what I'm going to do is start moving up this number box that will ramp up the frequency of the sine wave. So first we're just going to start with this sine wave, and we're going to hear what it sounds like as it comes into our audible frequency range and goes up. These low frequencies are absolutely audible for humans, but your speakers or headphones may or may not be able to produce them. Getting up to here, we're in the low and mid bass range. As we move up from 100 to about 300 and 400 hertz, we're starting to hear the mid-range of the piano and A440, which is what we tune instruments to. As I continue to go up higher, we'd be moving up the range into the mid-highs. As we get up above 1,000 and 2,000 hertz, we're getting close to the last octave of the piano. Moving up to around 4,000 hertz, we're at the top notes of the piano. Please turn down your speakers as needed. And as I continue to go up, we get into whistle tones and very high tones. Notice it can be difficult to make distinctions between the pitches up here. We get to about 10,000 hertz. Very, very high. Even though that's mathematically halfway between, 1 hertz and 20,000, it is, because of the way we understand pitch as being logarithmic or exponential, this is the last octave that we can hear. From here to 20,000 is about just the very end of our hearing range. So some people can hear beyond 20,000 hertz. Many of us hear only up to about 15,000 or 16,000. That's not really a bad thing. It's really not that much that we're missing way up there. Part of my goal for this was for you to hear how the different ranges of frequency, let's say from 20 to 100 and from 10,000 to 20,000, the ranges have a really different effect on us and sound really different. From about 20 to 100 hertz is the entire range of the bass instruments, the lowest couple octaves of the piano or a few octaves of the piano. The mid-range from, let's say, 100 hertz to 800 hertz is like the middle range of the piano, and the high range of the piano, maybe 800 hertz to 4,000. Beyond 4,000, think about there's no instrument in the orchestra, with a couple very rare exceptions, that can really play beyond that. So we have this whole range of frequency from about, let's say, 5,000 to 20,000 that is really just whistle tones and is mostly responsible for subtle distinctions in timbre, which we'll be getting into more soon. So it's not necessarily going to be audible as different pitches. Now thinking separately about the low range, I'm going to use instead here this sawtooth wave on the side. So the sawtooth wave, instead of being pure and only one partial like the sine wave, the sawtooth wave, which is made with this phaser, the sawtooth wave has many harmonics, so it's much brighter and it's a buzzy sound. It both looks in waveform and sounds kind of like a saw. I've divided this one by 20 in volume, so it should be quiet. It's a very intense sound, but I want to try to hear what happens when we go to the low range. So we know that our hearing ranges supposedly bottoms out at 20 hertz. So what happens below that? I'm going to start by turning this up to, let's say, 50 hertz, and then I'm going to roll down close to 0. What we'll hear is that in the case of our low hearing range, instead of disappearing into the ether like the high frequencies, as we get lower and lower, instead what happens is the sound pivots from being what we perceive as a pitch at around 20 hertz into what we perceive as a rhythm. So the cycles of this sawtooth wave, you can imagine them going by starting here at 60. There's 60 of them happening per second. As we go down to 20, there's only 20 of them happening per second, and we hear that as a very, very low pitch. As I go down all the way to 1 hertz, we will only hear 1 click per second. So that means that we will still hear it, but instead it will sound like a metronome going at 60 BPM. Here's a little play around with our low range of hearing. So you may notice that hearing 1 hertz, since it's 1 beat per second, does sound like a metronome at 60 beats per minute. 2 hertz sounds like 120 beats per minute, and 8 hertz sounds like 16th notes at that tempo. So we hear ta 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 ta. Those are the clicks of the cycle of the sawtooth going by. This can relate to something we can do with our voice. It's called vocal fry, and it is used by Russian bass singers and those who like to experiment with their voice. As you go lower and lower singing, you can, like the sawtooth wave, move your vocal folds to still technically be singing, but to be clicking together at a very low rate. It sounds like this. It sounds a little bit like gargling, but that's actually using my vocal folds. So that's called vocal fry. I just share that for fun. So if you want to, you can go and experiment on your own with your hearing range. Just be careful, especially when you use the high frequencies, not to hurt your ears. Piano, or just a layout of a piano on the left, all 88 keys on the piano. And over on the far right is the frequency. You can just disregard these names in the middle. These are 2 different systems for naming notes. But if we just look at the lowest key here, key 1 on the piano, it's a low A. Its frequency is 27.5. Let's hear that. All the way up to the highest A on the piano, which is 3,520 hertz. The way that pitch works, our perception of pitch, is it's logarithmic or exponential. So each multiple of 2 is equivalent to an octave in music. This is kind of bonus information. You are not responsible for remembering this, but I wanted to explain it for those who are interested. The way that frequencies work with our perception of pitch is from one A to the next A up, it's 2 times the frequency. So here's all the A's, and again, I wanted us to just get a little bit familiar with what the different ranges sound like. Notice that because of that exponential nature, most of the range of the piano, first half of the range of the piano, fits in between, it looks like, so the first 44 keys of the piano are from 27 hertz to 329 hertz. So it's about 300 hertz range for half of the piano. And then the top half of the piano is from 349 hertz up to 4100. So it's about 10 times in frequency. Again, that's just bonus information, but it can help you to think about frequencies that, half of the piano's range is in with a few hundred hertz, and the top half is within about 3,500 hertz. Here they all are, all the A's on the piano from the bottom up, multiplied by 2 in frequency. The lowest note, 27.5 hertz. Then 55 hertz. Then 110, 220, 440, 880, 1760, and 3520. For the last segment of 2.2, I wanted to discuss a little bit of the basics of recording, synthesis, audio, analog and digital. And so you read in the Stolet and got to check out a little bit of the way he describes recording devices and signals. I'm going to describe them in my own way now. So I want to think about recording and synthesis as the 2 primary opposed ways that one can create or work with sound. Back in the 1950s, there was a revolution going on in electronic music. It was the very beginning of electronic music. And there were sort of two sides. One was recording, and that was called musique concrète in French, meaning concrete music, so making music from recorded sounds. The other side was synthesis. Synthesis is creating sounds from scratch. So using an oscillator, using a machine to generate a sound out of thin air. So again, recording versus synthesis. So these distinctions from early electronic music still apply in the ways that we can think about and study sound and the way that it's produced. When we have a recording, we make that with a microphone, and microphones come in a lot of different sizes and shapes and designs, but they all work the same way. What they're doing is measuring the sound, the differential of airwave pressure, and measuring that in voltage differences. So we talked about the hummingbird being next to our ear, and our ear is the receiver. In this case, the microphone would be the receiver when we record the hummingbird. So just like our ear, the microphone has what's called a diaphragm in it. Usually it involves magnets. And this is, like our eardrum, is a sympathetic entity that can react to the waves around it. So inside of our eardrum, there is material that moves as the air around our ear moves. Same thing with a microphone. The diaphragm moves when the hummingbird is next to it. The hummingbird flaps its wings toward it, and the microphone moves in. It flaps its wings away, and the microphone diaphragm moves out. And so it obviously records. It records the differences in how far it moves, which would equate volume, and of course in time. And microphone is an analog piece of equipment, meaning it's not digital information yet, it's analog information, and that sends out an analog signal. So an analog signal is the type that runs through an audio cable, like a XLR mic cable or a guitar cable. That's analog audio information. It's fluctuating voltage, so it's taking the sound, in the case of a microphone, and converting what it receives into a fluctuating voltage signal. Transducers is another word for speakers. A transducer turns the sound from a fluctuating analog signal into a moving woofer or tweeter on the speaker that makes it make sound. So a transducer is a speaker. It takes the analog signal and reproduces the sound by moving in and out. So I've talked about how the speaker cones will move in and out, just like the wings of the hummingbird. They move and trace along the path given to them by the analog signal, and they recreate sound that way. There are two little terms that you will hear with speakers that we should define. One is the tweeter, which is the high frequencies. So the tweeter is a small speaker producing high frequencies. And its counterpart is the woofer. You've heard probably of a subwoofer. So a subwoofer is a very large woofer. And these are large speaker cones, speakers that produce low frequencies. So usually on a set of speakers, you will have both, and they work together to produce all the sound. So on a set of larger speakers, there's a tweeter on top, and it covers, let's say, the top 80% of the sound, and the woofer down below that covers maybe the bottom 60%. They overlap in the middle where they both produce the sound. A digital signal is different, and we just want to be, for this course, kind of familiar with the basics of digital sound. So just try to get the very basics of this. A digital signal is not fluctuating voltage. It's like all digital info. It's numbers coded. It's coded binary. So binary, of course, is just a different way of counting as opposed to decimal. So the binary data for a sound is calculated in samples. So the way that that works is as the analog signal is fed into an ADC, which is an analog to digital converter, then it converts it into digital by sampling it. Now, this use of the word sample is different than when we talk about sampling in music recording, when you take a little bit of someone else's song and sample it. And that is a different meaning, although they are kind of alluding to the same meaning of the word sample, which is to take a little bit of something. In this case, the little bit that's being taken for a digital audio signal it's a measurement of the volume in time. So let me jump over and show you how samples work in the waveform. Waveform for our Hummingbird. We can now use it to think about sampling. So if we had an analog version of this sound that we were looking at, it would essentially look the same, but it would be totally smooth. Digital is a rounding off of information. If any of this is something you need to review, please go check the Stolet article again, the Electronic Music Interactive, where he goes into detail about this. So if we had an analog signal, this is what it would look like coming through the microphone, going into a speaker. But this is very subtly different. This is a digital signal, and I will show you why. When I zoom very far in, now we're getting down to the thousandths of a second, we can look at the sound, and again, this would look like analog would look. But if I go even further in, and I look very, very closely, we can see these dots. These dots are the samples. So an analog signal would not have dots because it wouldn't need them, and it would follow probably about the same trajectory, but it wouldn't have these sample points. The way these sample points work is when an analog signal is fed into an ADC, an analog to digital converter, what it does is to sample the volume or amplitude. So if we think about our labels over here in decibels, we can see what it's doing. So at a regular pace, you notice the dots are the same distance apart. I'm zoomed very, very, very far in now to the 10,000th of a second. They're all the same distance apart. What it's doing is saying, how loud are you now? 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 And it takes a reading of the volume level at that point. So here it says -30, and that is encoded as a single binary bit of data that says -30. The next dot down is -32. All the way over here we have -18. And so it's a reading of the volume as we go along in time. What it then does when we have our DAC, our digital to analog converter, is the DAC converts it back to analog by connecting the dots. So when I press play, I hear through the speakers, through the transducers, an analog sound. I hear an acoustic sound that is the computer tracing, connecting the dots between these samples. So essentially, an analog signal would look like this without the dots, and the digital signal has the dots that are being connected. Way back when digital audio first came along, it was way worse than analog. In fact, a lot of people still use analog because it has a warm and kind of smooth sound. Back when it first came out, these dots would only happen every second or every tenth of a second. Now, with faster computers, these samples happen 44,000 times a second. In the case of this file, 48,000 times per second. And it goes all the way up to 192,000 times per second. So if you think about an A440 or this Hummingbird that was about 100 hertz, So the hummingbird wing flaps 100 times per second. So in order to capture that 100 times per second, we need to be sampling it at least 100 times per second. In fact, to really get the sound right, we need to sample it way more than that. So if there were less dots, they would not connect as well, and that would be called aliasing. Um, Really, what I want you to know is just how digital audio works. It's samples of volume, and they happen, in the case of this hummingbird, about 4,000 times more than the hummingbird is flying. It's kind of like the way that video works, where our eyes process a certain amount of frames per second, and video is actually recorded at many more frames per second. It lets us try to get closer to reality by capturing all the little details and making sure, in this case, that there are no missteps when the dots are connected, that the dots really make a nice fluid line that follows exactly what the analog signal looked like. So as I say, this is not really an audio class or a technical class per se. I just want you to know the terms that were on the list I just showed, basically how analog and digital signals work. Here, the sample rate is how many samples per second, and some common ones are 44,100 hertz, meaning 44,100 times per second. It's also hertz. It's the frequency of sampling, so it's a little bit different than the frequency of the sound, but it is the same basic concept. So ADC converts analog to digital, DAC converts digital to analog. Finally, just returning to the difference between recording and synthesis. So that all related to recording when we were thinking about the hummingbird recording. Synthesis is different. It's synthesizing, meaning creating from scratch a new sound using an oscillator. So instead of the case of playing back a recording like with the hummingbird, my speakers are trying to reproduce that sound. In the case of synthesis, we are just creating a brand new sound. So it is very unnatural sounding, which could be appealing or not, depending on your taste, but it does not sound like a recording. It sounds like a pure and simple waveform. Some common waveforms are the sine wave and the sawtooth wave, the square wave or pulse wave, and triangle wave, which we'll return to a little bit in the next module. But synthesis, for now, I just want you to know, is different than recording because synthesis is creating a new sound from scratch. They have analog synthesizers that work with only analog signals, electric oscillators, and so you can have a keyboard that's fully analog and you plug it into an amp and there's no digital information involved. That was, of course, true of every synthesizer until the 80s or so. And then nowadays, we have a lot of digital synthesizers, or soft synths, which is a shortening of software synthesizer. Works the same way, but we start with a digital interface, like the Max MSP earlier, and we synthesize sound using a digital interface. So just to kind of tie things together and give an example of how these terms up here come together in recording and synthesis. In the case of the hummingbird, we have this example here. So the hummingbird flaps its wings, creating a disturbance in the air. That's our sound source. It's recorded by a microphone, which measures the pressure change in time. The changing voltage or air pressure is converted by the microphone as an analog signal. Then an ADC converts this analog signal to digital, and it does that through sampling by taking samples of how loud it is in time and connecting the dots. We could edit if we wanted to at this point that we have a digital sound file. For example, this hummingbird sound, I faded out the end of it, so I manipulated the sound once it was digitized. And then a DAC converts it back into analog. That analog signal of now fluctuating voltage again is sent to the transducer or the speakers. The transducers follow the voltage signal and move in and out at the same speed as the hummingbird wings. Our ears receive the signal and we hear a hummingbird, or a recording of one anyway. So this little example is here for you to just review the terms that we talked about up here, and you can reference the Stolet article as needed. The synthesis example is very similar, but with less steps. We could start with a digital synthesizer like Max MSP. We could press in what the frequency we want is, let's say 100 hertz, and we press go, and it produces a new sine wave which oscillates at 100 hertz. So we tell this digital synthesizer to oscillate at 100 hertz. It does so. We can't hear it yet, but a DAC converts it back into an analog signal. The analog signal is sent to the transducer, the speakers. The transducer follows the voltage signal in and out at 100 hertz exactly. So keep in mind, unlike the hummingbird, this pitch will be perfectly at 100 hertz the entire time, and there won't be any background noise. Our ears receive the signal as a pure, perfect 100 hertz sine tone. So that concludes what we're going to talk about for 2.2. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to review the Stolet article or any parts of this video, please do. If you have questions, let me know. Next time in 2.3, we'll be continuing on with other related topics.